Have you ever been on a flight at an altitude of over 30,000 feet and suddenly realized that in just a moment your entire life or someone else's could take a completely different turn? It was a normal flight. A quiet first-class cabin. A calm, successful black man sitting next to his son. Then a slap happened. Quiet, no warning, irrevocable. And in that moment the man stood before a choice that many of us have faced, albeit in different circumstances. Fight back or remain silent. Resist or let things pass as if nothing happened. Protect your ego or protect something bigger than yourself. If you were there, sitting in front of your status child, what would you do? The story you are about to hear is not just about a flight. It is about silence, about dignity, and about how one person can transform personal pain into real change. If you've ever been misunderstood, ever been treated unfairly, or ever had to swallow your anger to maintain peace, stay with this story. And if you feel it resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey with us. No one on that flight knew they were about to witness a moment that could change the lives of many people forever. That morning, the Atlantic Crown Airlines Boeing 787 glided slowly down the runway at San Francisco International Airport. The early morning sunlight streamed through the first-class windows, reflecting off the gleaming metal surfaces and the thin glasses neatly arranged on the folding table. Everything looks perfect, too perfect. The engine noise grew louder, steady, and firm. Passengers had fastened their seatbelts. The flight attendants had taken their jump seats. In just a few dozen seconds, the plane would leave the ground carrying over 200 people into the confined space at an altitude of 35,000 feet. Then suddenly, everything stopped. It wasn't because of the weather. It wasn't because of a technical malfunction. It wasn't because of disruptive passengers. An urgent command from the control center echoed in the pilot's headset. The voice was short and concise, leaving no room for questions. Abort takeoff. Return to gate immediately. The sudden braking sent many people lurching forward. A few soft cries rang out. The luxurious tranquility of first class was shattered by a very human feeling of unease. No one understood what was happening. No one was there, except for a black man sitting in seat 3A. He wasn't startled. He didn't turn around. He didn't ask any questions. He simply closed his eyes silently, as if he had known this would happen. If someone looked closely, they would see his hand resting on his thigh subtly tighten, then relax. A small, very small gesture. But it was a sign of someone accustomed to controlling himself in moments when others are most likely to lose their composure. His name is Malcolm Reed. Few people on this flight knew that Malcolm Reed was the CEO of Reed Maritime Group, a multi-billion-dollar logistics and supply chain conglomerate that controls vital shipping routes between North America, Africa, and Europe. A familiar name in the financial world, but virtually unknown to the general public. Malcolm doesn't like to show up. He doesn't need to. He was used to walking into rooms where the first glance directed at him was not one of approval but of suspicion. He was used to being underestimated, to being asked questions that others would never have to answer. Are you sure you're sitting in the right seat? Who do you work for? Would you like me to double-check your ticket? Those questions no longer angered him. They only tired him out. Today's flight was supposed to be a short break. Malcolm had just finished 3 intense days of board meetings in Silicon Valley. He was on his way to New York to attend his son Jordan Reed's graduation. Jordan sat next to him. The 23-year-old wore a simple gray hoodie, earphones in his ears, and a notebook on his lap. Jordan resembled his father in his quietness, but his eyes still held the youthful innocence of someone unfamiliar with the invisible forces of the world. Malcolm looked at his son, a mixture of pride and anxiety welling up inside him. He knew what Jordan would have to face. Not because he said it, but because he himself had lived through it. At the front of the cabin, Laura Mitchell, the flight's chief flight attendant, sat upright in her jump seat. Outwardly, she was the epitome of professionalism. Her uniform was impeccable. Her smile was the result of over 15 years in the industry. But inside, Laura was running out of steam. Long shifts, a packed flight schedule, complaint emails from wealthy demanding clients. A management system that's becoming increasingly cold towards veteran employees like her. Laura felt she was gradually becoming invisible. And when people feel invisible for too long, they begin to seek a sense of control in the smallest things. She glanced towards seats 3A and 3B. The black man was silent. The young man beside him was also silent. They don't cause trouble. They don't complain. They don't make demands. And it was that silence unconsciously that made Laura uncomfortable. She couldn't name the feeling. She only knew that in that moment something inside her was tensing up like an overloaded rope. The plane continued to taxi slowly, leaving the runway amidst the confusion of everyone on board. Malcolm opened his eyes. He looked out the window and saw white lines flashing by and then stopping. A ground crew member appeared in the distance. He let out a very soft sigh. A thought flashed through his mind, not fear but a familiar sadness. Here we go again. Malcolm didn't know exactly what was about to happen. But he knew one thing for sure. This flight will not take off as it was originally scheduled. And it all began with a very small moment. A moment when no one on that plane could have foreseen how big the consequences would be. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 gradually returned to an eerie silence after the sudden braking. It wasn't the pleasant silence often seen before takeoff, but a heavy silence. It weighed down on each passenger, making everyone feel as if they had missed something important, something they couldn't name. A middle-aged man in seat 1D subtly adjusted his tie. A silver-haired woman in 2C glanced at the Rolex watch on her wrist, shaking her head slightly. No one spoke, but their eyes shared the same question. What the hell just happened? Malcolm Reed remained seated upright in seat 3A. His seatbelt was still fastened. He wasn't in a hurry. He was never one to rush in moments like this. Experience had taught him that when the system suddenly came to a halt, the best thing to do was observe. Jordan, his son, took off one of his earphones and tilted his head towards his father. "Dad? What's wrong?" His voice was low, just loud enough so no one else could hear. Malcolm looked at his son, the corners of his lips curving into a very thin smile. "I don't know yet," he replied softly, "but just stay calm." Jordan nodded, though a hint of confusion still lingered in his eyes. He wasn't used to these kinds of uncertain moments. For Jordan, the plane either flew or it didn't. He had never considered the possibility that an invisible decision from the ground could leave hundreds of people waiting for just seconds. In the front row, Laura Mitchell removed her in-flight headset, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it in the small compartment beside the jump seat. She cleared her throat, adjusted her posture, and tried to project the image of a seasoned chief flight attendant. She had encountered many unusual situations in her career. Drunk passengers, seat disputes, panic attacks at 10,000 feet. But this time something was very different. No one caused a disturbance. There was no shouting. There was no chaos. It was just a cold, impersonal order from the control center, and everything stopped. Laura stood up and walked down the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin. Her heels tapped lightly on the floor, steadily, professionally. She spoke in a familiar voice, the voice of someone who had said these words 1,000 times. "Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. We are awaiting further instructions from the ground. Please remain fastened." Scattered nods, a few quiet okay. No one objected. But Laura could feel the eyes. So many eyes. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking behind her. Towards the third row of seats. She didn't turn back immediately. She knew that if she did, she would see something that would upset her, though she didn't know why. Instead, she stopped at the galley ahead, pretending to inspect a compartment that had already been thoroughly checked. Laura, a younger flight attendant, Emily Carter, whispered as she walked past. "Do you know what's going on?" Laura shook her head. "No, but I don't like this." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Laura didn't answer immediately. She looked at the dimly reflective metal of the locker. The face in it looked more tired than she'd expected, tiny wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. A tense look she couldn't remember the last time she'd had. "I have a feeling," Laura said slowly, "that someone on this flight thinks they're more special than everyone else." Emily was silent for a few seconds. "Who are you talking about?" Laura took a breath, then exhaled. "Row 3. Emily glanced quickly in that direction. Malcolm and Jordan were still sitting there, not talking, not using their phones, not showing any signs that would draw attention. "I don't see them doing anything wrong," Emily said slightly hesitantly. Laura pursed her lips. "Sometimes, Emily, it's not what they do that's the problem. It's their attitude." Emily didn't respond. She sensed something was wrong with the statement, but lacked the confidence to argue against it. Sitting in the third row, Malcolm sensed the atmosphere shift, though no one said it directly to him. It was a familiar feeling, like walking into a room and knowing all conversation has paused just because of your presence. He had learned to live with it. But what he never got used to was the feeling of having to ask himself, "What did I do wrong?" Malcolm looked down at his hands. Long fingers, faint calluses at the tips from years of writing, signing, and working tirelessly. He recalled his early days as an unknown logistics engineer walking into meetings where people mistook him for a driver or an assistant. He didn't get angry then, not because he was weak, but because he understood one thing very clearly. Anger rarely helps us win, but it always helps others eliminate us from the game. Jordan leaned forward and whispered, "Dad, do you feel like everyone's watching us?" Malcolm turned to his son. His gaze softened. "Yes," he replied, "but you don't need to carry that feeling with you." "But why?" Jordan asked. "We didn't do anything." Malcolm was silent for a moment. This was a question he had answered hundreds of times in his life, but each time he answered it, it still weighed as heavily as the first time. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people need a reason to explain their discomfort, and sometimes they choose the wrong person." Jordan said nothing more. He looked straight ahead, trying to appear calm, but in his heart a seed of doubt had been sown. Why is their silence so irritating to others? The plane finally came to a complete stop at the gate. The cabin door remained closed. A short announcement came from the cockpit this time, the captain's voice sounding a little firmer. "Ladies and gentlemen, for operational reasons we will be temporarily returning to the gate. Please remain seated." Laura stood by the aisle, her hands clasped together. She glanced toward row 3 again, this time without flinching. Her eyes met Malcolm's. In just 1 second. There was no challenge, no contempt, just a calm, weary, and very human gaze. And that gaze for some reason made Laura feel as if she had been exposed, as if the man saw something in her that she herself didn't want to confront. She turned away first. In that moment, Laura didn't realize she had just stood at a very small crossroads. A crossroads where if she stopped, took a deeper breath, and let the emotions flow, things could have been different. But life rarely gives us a chance to realize our mistakes before they happen. And this flight, even though it has come to a stop on the ground, has actually only just begun its journey. Malcolm Reed wasn't always as good at keeping quiet as he is now. There was a time long before he became CEO of Reed Maritime Group, before his name appeared in those thick financial reports, when he also thought that telling the truth was enough to be treated fairly. He learned that he was wrong. Malcolm grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in a neighborhood that was unremarkable except for the resilience of its people. His father was a dock worker, his mother a night shift nurse. They weren't rich, but they had something Malcolm carried with him throughout his life: discipline. His father often said the same thing in a low, slow voice, as if wanting each word to sink into his son. "You can't control how other people see you, but you can always control how you stand." Malcolm remembers vividly the first time he realized he was being looked at differently. It was when he was 17 during an orientation at a prestigious technical university in the Northeast. A professor with graying hair looked at the list of names, then at him, and asked directly in front of the class, "Are you here on a sports scholarship?" Everyone in the room chuckled softly. Malcolm stood still. His heart pounded. His mouth opened, then closed. He wanted to say so many things. He wanted to explain that he was at the top of his math class, that he had studied day and night to be there. But then he saw his father's eyes in his memory. Calm. No bowing of the head. No hasty reaction. "No, sir," Malcolm said. "I'm here for the grades." The room fell silent. The professor nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. The lesson continued. That was the first time Malcolm understood that sometimes victory isn't about talking more but about not letting others drag you down to their level. In the years that followed, similar situations repeated themselves. In interviews. In his first meetings when he first entered the logistics industry. Off-topic questions. Scrutinizing glances. Compliments implying that his success was unexpected. Each time Malcolm learned to breathe deeper. He learned to respond more concisely. He learned to keep his emotions in a place where others couldn't reach them. It's not that he doesn't feel pain. It's because he understands that if he lets pain control him, he won't get far. Reed Maritime Group originated from a small warehouse near Savannah Port. Malcolm and two friends rented it with money his mother had saved over many years. Initially, they only took on small contracts, shipping routes that larger companies wouldn't even consider. Malcolm worked 16 hours a day. He slept on the sofa in his office. He ate cold meals. And every time he walked into a meeting room with bigger clients, he saw that familiar gaze, a suspicious look. Once during an important negotiation in New Jersey, an executive turned to his assistant and said loud enough for Malcolm to hear, "Is he a delivery guy?" Malcolm didn't react. He simply pulled out a chair, sat down, opened his laptop, and presented a more detailed plan than anyone else in the room. The meeting ended with a 5-year contract. As he stepped outside, one of his business partners patted him on the shoulder and gave a forced smile. "You're quite different from what I thought." Malcolm nodded. "Yes," he replied. "I've heard that many times." That was his life. Not a series of dramatic confrontations, but a steady flow of moments that forced him to choose between instinct and self-control. And he always chose the latter. Now, sitting on the Atlantic Crown Airlines flight, Malcolm felt a familiar sensation returning. It wasn't noisy, it wasn't sharp, it was just a gentle pressure like the air before a thunderstorm. He glanced at Jordan. His son was looking out the window, his eyes reflecting the pale gray sky outside. Malcolm knew what Jordan was thinking. He used to be Jordan. "What are you thinking about?" Malcolm asked, his voice low. Jordan turned around. "I was thinking, do I have to learn to get used to this?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He considered his words carefully. This wasn't a lecture. This was a sharing of life experience. "You don't need to get used to being treated badly," he said. "But you need to get used to not letting it define you." Jordan was silent. "But there are times when I want to say something." Malcolm nodded. "I know. And there will come a time when you should tell me. But the important thing is that you choose the right time, the right place, and the right way." He placed his hand on his son's arm, squeezing gently. "Silence isn't weakness, Jordan. Silence is a tool. Like any tool, it's only dangerous when misused." In front, Laura Mitchell stood beside the galley holding a cup of now cold coffee. She gazed down at the dark liquid, not really seeing it. Her mind was filled with disjointed thoughts. She had worked on airplanes since she was very young. She had learned to smile even when tired, learned to tolerate unreasonable complaints. But lately she felt she was losing her ability to endure. She couldn't understand why Malcolm's calmness bothered her so much. He hadn't done anything wrong. But it was precisely that calmness that made her feel judged, even though no words were spoken. Perhaps Laura thought he thinks he's better than everyone else. The thought came to her very quickly, like a reflex. And instead of questioning it, Laura let it stay. Little did she know that somewhere in this airplane cabin, a series of tiny choices were lined up waiting for their turn. And each choice, however small, was pushing things closer to a point of no return. Malcolm leaned his head back against the chair, closing his eyes. He wasn't asleep. He was just listening to his own breathing, keeping it steady and slow. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He won't let anger get the better of him. Not today, not in front of my son. And that very choice, though seemingly quiet and invisible at this moment, will soon become the focal point of a storm that no one in the entire cabin is aware of. Laura Mitchell once believed she was a strong woman. She had been flying for over 15 years. She had encountered all kinds of passengers, from polite people to those who treated flight attendants like mobile furniture. She had learned to smile when ignored, nod when given orders, and swallow her fatigue to complete the next flight. At least that's what she kept telling herself. But this morning, standing in first class on Atlantic Crown Airlines, Laura felt that familiar facade was thinner than usual. She had woken up at 4 in her cramped Oakland apartment. Her old car wouldn't start, forcing her to call a ride-hailing service at double the usual price. Before leaving home, she received an email from Human Resources reiterating recent negative feedback regarding service attitude. It wasn't the first time, but it was the most exhausting time for her. Laura spent the entire morning trying to convince herself that she wasn't the problem, that passengers these days are too demanding, that the company no longer values long-time employees like her, that the world is changing in a way that makes people like her obsolete, and when people believe they are being treated unfairly, they often unconsciously seek out a place to vent those feelings. The first-class cabin was unusually quiet this morning. No special requests. No frantic calls. There was no one for Laura to run around to, and no one for her to prove that she was still needed. There was only silence. And at the heart of that silence was Malcolm Reed. Laura didn't know his name. She didn't know he was the CEO. She only saw a black man, simply dressed, sitting upright, his gaze so calm it was almost indifferent. She was used to the other first-class passengers. They were usually either demanding or trying too hard to be friendly. Malcolm was different. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't engage in small talk. He didn't try to get attention. That calmness to Laura felt like a silent challenge. She wondered, not exactly in words but in feeling, who does he think he is? Laura stood in the galley, flipping through the safety checklist for the third time, even though she knew everything had been done correctly. Emily Carter approached, carrying a tray of water. "Laura," Emily said softly. "Is there anything else I can help with?" Laura shook her head. "No need." Emily hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Are you okay?" The question, though simple, irritated Laura. It touched upon a weakness she didn't want to admit. "I'm fine," Laura replied, more quickly than necessary. "Just do your work." Emily nodded and stepped back. A slight unease welled up inside her. She had seen Laura tense before, but never like this. Laura took a deep breath, picked up the cold coffee cup and took a small sip. The bitterness spread across her tongue, making her frown. She set the cup down, adjusted her uniform, and turned to walk down the aisle. Her gaze then returned to seat 3. Malcolm and his son remained seated. Jordan was writing something in his notebook. Malcolm gazed out the window, his face expressionless. Laura felt her heart race. A thought flashed through her mind: they shouldn't look so relaxed. She moved closer, stopping at a distance just right for her voice to be heard clearly but not so conspicuously. "Sir," Laura said, her voice already slightly stiff. "Please double-check the position of your carry-on luggage. The strap is sticking out." Malcolm bent down to look. The strap of his leather bag was indeed sticking out a little under the seat in front of him. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm. "I'm sorry." He bent down, adjusted the bag, and tucked it neatly inside. The movement was slow, cooperative, and without a hint of resistance. Jordan looked up at Laura, then at his father, his brow slightly furrowed. He sensed something was amiss in this situation, though he couldn't quite explain it. Laura stood there waiting. Part of her expected a further explanation, or at least a more explicit apology, But Malcolm simply sat up straight, placing his hands on his lap as if it were all over. The silence lasted another second, then 2 seconds. Laura felt like she had been ignored. And she continued, her voice slightly higher while preparing for takeoff. Please ensure all personal belongings, including books and electronic devices, are securely stored. Malcolm turned his head and looked at Laura. His expression wasn't one of annoyance, just a hint of surprise. I understand, he said. Can I keep this notebook in my hand? I don't use electronic devices. Laura shook her head. The rules require all items to be put away. Her voice now carried a different tone. It wasn't just an announcement, it was a command. Malcolm didn't argue. He nodded, tucking the notebook into the seat pocket in front of him. He did everything exactly as requested, no more, no less. But when he looked up, his eyes met Laura's again. There was no provocation, no challenge, just a very slight, very real weariness. And that look made Laura feel like she had just lost something. Control. She turned and walked quickly toward the galley. Her heart pounded not from victory but from a vague, unsettling feeling. She had followed the rules. But why wasn't she satisfied? Emily looked at Laura and noticed her expression change. Are you okay? Emily asked. Laura nodded, but her voice trembled slightly. They need to learn how to follow the rules. Emily was silent. In her mind, the image of the man in seat 3A flashed. He had complied with every request, not a single complaint. Do you think they didn't comply? Emily asked very softly. Laura turned, her eyes sharpening. Emily, you're young. You don't understand passengers like that yet. Emily didn't answer, but a heavy feeling welled up inside her. She wasn't sure who such passengers were. Sitting in the third row, Malcolm felt his heart rate quicken slightly, not from fear but because he recognized something familiar. When all requirements have been met, but tension remains, then the issue is no longer about regulations. He turned to Jordan and whispered, "Are you all right?" Jordan nodded, but his voice was low. "I just find it strange." Malcolm understood. He had felt strange many times in his life. And he knew that feeling rarely disappeared quickly. He sat up straight, placed his hands on his lap and breathed steadily. He didn't want things to escalate. Not for himself, but for his son. But somewhere in this airplane cabin, tiny choices are still being made. And each choice, whether masked by regulations or professional duty, is pulling that tightrope a little further. Laura stood in the galley looking at the to-do list but not actually reading it. Only one thought kept repeating in her mind. He thinks he's better than me. And when people believe such a story for too long, they will soon find a way to prove it at all costs. Atlantic Crown Airlines' first-class cabin is never as noisy as economy class. Here conflicts are handled in silence, masked by polite smiles and carefully chosen words. But that very politeness sometimes makes things sharper. After Laura Mitchell returned to the galley, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to thicken. Malcolm Reed sensed this change acutely, though no one said anything. It was the feeling when a room had chosen a center of attention and all eyes silently turned toward it. Jordan shifted slightly in his chair, then stopped as if afraid of attracting more attention. He opened his notebook and scribbled a few lines, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time he heard footsteps approaching, he instinctively looked up. Malcolm placed his hand on his son's arm, a very gentle gesture. "It's all right," he said softly. His voice was low and even loud enough for Jordan to hear, but not loud enough to attract anyone else's attention. In the galley, Laura was standing next to Emily Carter. She was looking at the safety checklist on the small screen but wasn't actually reading it. The words flashed before her eyes without leaving a trace. "Laura," Emily said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "The passenger in seat 3 has complied with all the requirements." Laura didn't turn around. "Do you think I didn't see?" Emily swallowed hard. "I mean, maybe we could just leave them alone. This flight is stressful enough already." Laura turned around. Her eyes turned cold for a split second. "Emily," she said, her voice lowered. "You're so young. You don't fully understand what happens when you let things go too far." "But they didn't," Emily began then, stopped when she saw Laura's expression. "That's enough," Laura interrupted. "Rules are rules." Emily nodded and stepped back, but a feeling of unease more pronounced than before gripped her. She had worked with Laura long enough to know that when Laura said that things rarely stopped, Laura adjusted her collar, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the galley. This time her steps were faster and more decisive, as if she were heading to a predetermined destination. She stopped beside the third row, her eyes quickly scanning Malcolm and then Jordan. "Sir," Laura said, her voice firmer than before, "please make sure your phone is on airplane mode." Malcolm looked down at his phone, which was plugged into a power bank on his lap. The screen clearly displayed an airplane icon. "It's in airplane mode," he replied, slightly raising the screen. "I'm just reviewing my notes." Laura looked at the screen, then at Malcolm. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. "I need you to put away both your phone and the charger," she said, "while we're preparing for takeoff." Malcolm frowned slightly. "According to regulations, I can keep the device in airplane mode until the plane starts taxiing. This battery is also within the permitted limits." His voice wasn't loud, not harsh, just a truth stated calmly. But for Laura, that statement was no longer information. It was more like a correction, a reminder that she might be wrong, and that annoyed her. "Sir," Laura said, this time her voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, "I am asking you to follow the flight attendant's instructions." Malcolm felt eyes turning toward him. He took a deep breath. Part of him wanted to end this immediately, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't want Jordan to have to witness any more. He unplugged the charger, coiled it neatly, and placed both the phone and the charger into his bag. The movements were slow and deliberate. When finished, he looked up at Laura. "Is that okay?" he asked. The question, though perfectly reasonable, was like a small spark. Laura felt her cheeks flush. "Okay," she replied quickly. "Now, of course." She turned away immediately without waiting for another word. The sound of her heels echoed along the path, steady but heavy. Jordan watched, then turned to his father. "Did you do something wrong, Dad?" Malcolm shook his head. "No." "So why?" Jordan didn't finish the sentence. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He stared straight ahead where the first-class cabin lights reflected off the metal surface. He considered each word as he had done his whole life. "Sometimes," he said, "when people have decided that you are the problem, then no matter what you do, you are still the problem." Jordan was silent. He felt his throat dry up. He had never heard his father say this in that tone before. Not bitter, just a stark truth. Ahead, Laura stopped at the galley, her hand gripping the edge of the table. She felt her heart pound. She had won. The passengers had complied. But the feeling in her heart wasn't one of satisfaction. It was something heavy, as if she'd just taken another step without knowing where she wanted to go. Emily stepped closer, speaking very softly. "Laura, they've done as instructed. Maybe we should." Laura turned, her eyes cold. "Emily, whose side are you on?" That question left Emily speechless. I just thought you're just overthinking it," Laura interrupted. "Our job is to ensure safety and order, not to befriend the passengers." Emily nodded and stepped back, but in her heart one thought refused to disappear: order for whom the plane's doors remained closed. There were no new announcements from the cockpit. Time seemed to drag on, each minute passing slowly. Malcolm leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He heard the engine idling, the air conditioner blowing steadily, and someone coughing softly. He knows this feeling. The feeling when things have crossed the line from a simple misunderstanding. When small clashes begin to accumulate, it's no longer about right or wrong, but about who will be the one to back down. He didn't want to escalate the situation. But he also knew that in situations like this, taking another step back wouldn't solve anything. Jordan placed his hand on his thigh, squeezing it gently. He felt his heart race. Part of him wanted to stand up, say something, defend his father. But Malcolm's calm gaze held him back. "Sit still," his eyes said. "Observe." In the galley, Laura looked at the to-do list, but the letters blurred. In her mind, the image of the man in seat 3A kept flashing. Calm, cooperative, not at all challenging. And that's what annoyed her more than any opposition. She didn't realize that in this moment her choices were no longer about regulations. It was becoming a silent power struggle. And such struggles on a plane about to take off rarely end peacefully. The plane remained stationary. No one knew that just one more minor collision would send everything spiraling out of control. There's a very thin line between enforcing regulations and demonstrating power. The problem is when people are tired and hurt for too long, that line often disappears before they even realize it. The first-class cabin of Atlantic Crown Airlines was quiet, but it was the quiet of people waiting for something unnamed. Time seemed to slow down so much that every small sound became clearer than usual. The rustling of paper as a passenger turned a newspaper. A suppressed cough, a barely audible sigh. Malcolm Reed opened his eyes and looked up at the cabin ceiling. The soft light remained unchanged, but the feeling in his chest was different. He knew from his experience that it wasn't over yet. Jordan sat beside him, his hands clasped together. He was no longer pretending to write. He just sat there silently, as if waiting for a signal. "Dad," Jordan said, very softly, "if this continues, what should we do?" Malcolm turned to look at his son. There was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. He didn't want to teach his son to tolerate injustice, but he also didn't want to teach him to react with anger. "Just stay with me," he replied. "I'll take care of the rest." In front of her, Laura Mitchell stood beside the galley, hands on her hips. She felt as if the entire cabin was testing her. No one spoke, but in her mind a question echoed repeatedly. Why didn't he react? She was used to passengers protesting, complaining, even shouting. She knew how to handle them. But Malcolm wasn't. His calmness gave her no leverage. There was nothing for her to correct her mistakes, and nothing for her to prove she was right. And that made her feel like she was gradually losing control. Laura stepped out of the galley once more. This time she wasn't in a hurry. Each step was slow and deliberate. She stopped beside row 3 without speaking immediately. Malcolm sensed her presence before he heard her voice. "Sir," Laura said, her voice low but sharp. "I need to double-check your seating area." Malcolm nodded slightly. "Yes." Laura bent down, looked under the seat, then into the seat pocket in front of her. Everything was tidy. Nothing was in violation. She straightened up, silent for a second. Jordan felt his heart pounding faster. He didn't understand why, but he knew that this moment of silence wasn't the end. "Where are you going today?" Laura asked. The question came as a surprise. It wasn't part of any established procedure. Malcolm frowned slightly, then answered, "New York," he said. "Family." Laura nodded as if she had anticipated it. "Work or rest?" Malcolm kept his voice calm. "Both." A few passengers around them started to take notice. These questions were no longer professional in nature. They resembled a light-hearted interrogation disguised in politeness. "What does he work in?" Laura continued. Jordan turned to look at Laura, clearly confused. Malcolm sensed his son's gaze, but he didn't turn. He looked straight at Laura. "I work in logistics," he replied. Laura raised an eyebrow. "Logistics? Yes. I mean," she continued, her voice tinged with undisguised sarcasm. "Which part are you in charge of?" Malcolm had heard this question countless times in his life. He could have answered it with lengthy job titles, revenue figures, or company size, but he didn't. "I run the company," he said. At that moment, something changed in Laura's eyes. A very faint smile appeared, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh," she said. "Is that so?" Jordan felt a surge of heat in his chest. He opened his mouth, intending to say something, but Malcolm gently placed his hand on Jordan's, a small gesture but decisive. Laura stood there for another second, then uttered a sentence that made the air in the cabin freeze. "You know," she said, lowering her voice, but loud enough for those around her to hear, "we often encounter passengers who think they are more special than everyone else." The word special is emphasized very subtly, but its meaning is anything but light. Malcolm looked at Laura. For the first time his gaze changed, not anger, but the coldness of someone who had just realized what they had been trying to avoid had finally surfaced. "I don't think so," he said slowly. "I just think I'm complying with all the requirements." Laura tilted her head. "Not everyone thinks that way, Mr. Reed." She had just read his name from the boarding pass, but the way she pronounced it sent a shiver down Jordan's spine. It was as if the name had been given a new, not-so-pleasant definition. Emily Carter stood in the galley, her hands gripping the serving tray tightly. She felt her stomach churn. She knew very well that things had gone too far. "Laura," Emily said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I think we've checked enough." Laura turned around, her eyes sharp. "Emily, I'm handling the situation, but this is no longer a safety issue," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "They have. Are you saying I did something wrong?" Laura interrupted. Emily remained silent. She bowed her head, but inwardly a different choice was forming. She knew that if she didn't speak up now, she would have to live with it for a long time. Sitting in the third row, Malcolm took a deep breath. He clearly sensed that the situation had crossed the line from a misunderstanding. The questions, the perspectives, the words, they all pointed in one direction. He recalled countless similar moments in his life, times when he wondered if he was imagining things too much, if he was being overly sensitive. But this time he wasn't alone. Jordan was sitting next to him. And Malcolm knew that the most dangerous thing wasn't letting his son see injustice, but letting his son see injustice without anyone calling out his name. "Miss Laura," Malcolm said, his voice still calm, but now carrying a new weight. "I'm not sure these questions are still relevant to flight safety." Laura stared at him. "What are you implying I'm saying?" Malcolm replied, each word carefully chosen. "That I feel I'm being treated differently, even though I've followed all the instructions." The atmosphere around us seemed to hold its breath. A man in the second row shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable. A woman in front of him looked down, avoiding eye contact. Laura chuckled softly. "You're being too sensitive." Those words fell into the airplane cabin like a heavy object. Jordan clenched his fist. Malcolm felt it. He placed his hand on his son's, holding on a little tighter. He didn't reply immediately. He knew that from this moment on, any words he uttered could be interpreted in the most unfavorable way. Laura turned away, as if she had won once again. But deep inside she felt a strange sensation, not satisfaction, rather an unnamed unease. Emily stood there, her heart pounding. She knew that what had just happened wouldn't disappear just because Laura turned her back. Malcolm sat back in his chair, his back straight, his gaze fixed ahead. He wasn't trembling, he wasn't angry, but in his heart a decision was slowly forming. He had been silent long enough in his life. But there are moments when silence is no longer protection, it is acceptance. And he knew that moment was drawing very near. There are moments in life that are quiet and undramatic, yet carry the weight of an entire past. Malcolm Reed sat upright in seat 3A, his hands resting on his laps, palms pressed against the cool fabric of the seat. Outside the window, the pale gray sky stretched endlessly as if time had paused there. He no longer looked out, he looked inward. Laura Mitchell's questions still echoed in his head. Not the specific words, but the feeling behind them. A feeling so familiar that he could recognize it within the first few seconds of a conversation. Suspicion, comparison, and an unconscious need to place him in the exact position that others find comfortable. Malcolm closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He could hear his own breathing, slow and steady. He had learned this technique years ago in meeting rooms where all eyes awaited his reaction. React incorrectly and you'll become a problem. Don't react and you'll be seen as weak. Between those two options, Malcolm was always looking for a third path. Jordan sat beside him silent, but Malcolm could sense his son's tension. It was the tension of a young man realizing for the first time that the world doesn't always operate according to the fair logic he once believed it to. "Dad," Jordan said, very softly, almost a whisper. "Are you okay?" Malcolm opened his eyes and turned to look at his son. There was weariness in his eyes but no fear. "I'm fine," he replied. "How about you?" Jordan hesitated for a moment. "I don't like the way they talk to Dad." Malcolm nodded. "I know. So why didn't I say anything more?" Jordan asked. "Why did I let this continue?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was a genuine question stemming from confusion. And Malcolm knew this was one of those rare moments when he had to choose his answer very carefully. He looked straight into his son's eyes. "Do you remember what I told you about choosing the right timing?" Jordan nodded. "Yes. This is one of those times," Malcolm said. "If I react just to vent my anger, I'll be teaching you that anger is a way to solve problems. But if I stay silent, I'm also teaching you that injustice is something to be accepted." Jordan swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He turned his face forward, staring into the space between the rows of seats. Old memories resurfaced in his mind. He recalled a meeting many years ago when Reed Maritime Group had just signed its first major contract with an international shipping corporation. Malcolm walked into the meeting room wearing a simple suit. A man sitting at the head of the table stood up and extended his hand. "I think you're the driver," he said half-jokingly. The whole room burst out laughing. Malcolm could have reacted. He could have mentioned the value of the contract, his role. But he didn't. He just smiled, sat down, and let the results speak for themselves. At the end of the meeting, the man approached him and whispered, "I was wrong." Malcolm remembers the feeling very clearly. Not gloating, but a quiet relief. But this flight is different. Here there's no time for lengthy explanations based on results, no data tables, no reports, just a confined airplane cabin, a series of minor collisions, and a young boy watching him to learn how to be a good person. Malcolm turned to Jordan. "You don't need to react on my behalf," he said, "but you need to see me do the right thing." Jordan was silent, then nodded. At the front of the plane, Laura Mitchell stood next to the galley, her back to the passengers. She looked at the small screen displaying flight information, but the numbers didn't register in her mind. She felt tired, not physically tired, but mentally tired. Every time she thought of Malcolm's gaze, a wave of discomfort washed over her. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had done nothing at all. That calmness was like a mirror reflecting thoughts Laura didn't want to confront. She told herself she was just doing her job, just maintaining order, just enforcing the rules. But a part of her knew that if it had been another passenger, she probably would have stopped a long time ago. Emily Carter stood at the back of the galley, her hands gripping the serving tray tightly. She felt like she was caught between two worlds. On one side was her superior, the man who had guided her in her early days on the job. On the other side was the reality unfolding before her eyes. Emily recalled the instruction from her first training session: every passenger deserves to be treated with equal respect. She looked toward the third row. That man wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't insulting. He was just there. Emily took a deep breath. She knew that if things went any further, she would have to make a choice she had never considered. Malcolm glanced at the watch on his wrist. Time was passing slower than usual. Each passing minute brought with it a sense of anticipation, not waiting for an announcement, but waiting for the next step. He knew that if Laura returned with the same tone of voice, things would never remain the same. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He'd been confronting people his whole life. But he feared the price Jordan would pay if he chose the wrong path. Malcolm wondered what was most important in this moment, his honor, or the lesson he left for his son. The answer came quickly and was very clear. Honor isn't about winning an argument. Honor is about knowing when to let the system speak for you. He opened his eyes, his gaze becoming sharper yet maintaining his usual composure. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew he wouldn't let things just go on, as if nothing had happened. In the galley, Laura turned around. Her eyes scanned the first-class compartment, then settled on row 3. A thought flashed through her mind: I'm not finished yet. She stepped out once more. Emily watched her, heart pounding. She sensed something inevitable drawing very near. Malcolm straightened his back as if his body had prepared for it. Jordan sensed the change but said nothing. He simply sat still, observing just as his father had taught him. In that cramped airplane cabin, 3 people stand before 3 different choices. And with just one wrong word, one wrong gesture, everything will cross the final boundary. The silence lasted for a few more seconds. Then Laura stopped beside them, and Malcolm knew the decisive moment had arrived. There are moments in life when time seems to shrink to just a few seconds. Everything that came before becomes the context. Everything that follows becomes the consequence. Laura Mitchell stopped next to the 3rd row of seats. This time she was standing very close. So close that Jordan Reed could smell the faint scent of perfume on her uniform. He instinctively looked up, then stopped, when he saw his father's gaze still fixed straight ahead. Malcolm Reed sensed a familiar pressure weighing down the space around him. Not physical pressure, but the psychological pressure of a situation that had been pushed too far. He didn't turn immediately. He waited. Sir Laura said, her voice low but firm, "I need your attention." Malcolm turned slowly. His gaze was calm but no longer vacant. This was the look of a man who had made a decision. "Yes," he replied. Laura took a shallow breath. A jumble of thoughts swirled in her head. A feeling of being disregarded. The pressure of work. A vague fear that she was losing control of the very plane she was in charge of. "Do you know," she said, "that your attitude from the beginning of the flight until now has caused us difficulties?" Jordan froze. Malcolm stared directly at Laura. "I'm not sure what attitude you're referring to," he replied. "I've complied with all the requests." Laura tilted her head, a small but meaningful gesture. "It's the way he talks," she replied. "The way he looks. The way he sits there as if everything revolves around him." Some of the passengers around them began to pay closer attention. Some leaned slightly forward. Some held their breath. Malcolm felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. "If there is anything specific I did wrong," he said, "please point it out." That statement, while perfectly reasonable, was like the final straw. Laura felt her face flush. Part of her knew she was going too far. But the other part, the one that had been suppressed for years, refused to back down. "Don't pretend," she said, her voice rising. "I've seen plenty of passengers like you before." Malcolm frowned slightly. "The kind of passenger like me?" The question was asked calmly. But it was precisely that calmness that made Laura feel challenged. "Yes," she replied, no longer concealing it. "Those people who come up here, put on their headphones, sit silently and think they're above everyone else." Jordan jumped up halfway from his chair. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice trembling. Malcolm reached out and held Jordan back. He didn't look at his son, but the gesture was enough for Jordan to understand that he needed him to sit down. "Sit still," Malcolm said softly. "Let me speak." He turned back towards Laura. "Miss Laura," Malcolm said, his voice low and firm, "I don't think this conversation has anything to do with safety or regulations anymore." Laura chuckled softly. "Are you blaming me?" "I'm saying," Malcolm replied, "that I feel I'm being treated differently." The air in the cabin felt like it was freezing. Laura stared at him. A malicious thought flashed through her mind, quick and sharp as a knife. "You're being too sensitive," she said. "Men are always like that." The moment the words were spoken, even Laura felt a chill run down her spine. But it was too late. "You gentlemen," Malcolm repeated very slowly. A deathly silence fell over the plane. Jordan felt his ears ringing. He looked around, seeing a few averted gazes, some confused faces, and a few people who were clearly in shock. Emily Carter stood in the galley, her heart pounding. She opened her mouth to say something, but it was too late. Malcolm stood still for a few seconds. He clearly felt the final boundary had just been crossed. No more speculation, no more vague feelings. Everything had been named. "What did you just say?" Malcolm asked, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. Laura felt a slight wave of panic rising within her, but instead of stopping, she took another half step, as if trying to suppress the feeling. I said, she replied, that you men always think you have the right to argue about everything. Jordan jumped up. You have no right, Jordan, Malcolm said, his voice still low but firm. He stopped. He sat down. His hands clenched. Malcolm looked at Laura, his eyes no longer weary. They were eerily still. This conversation, he said, has gone too far. And then everything happened very quickly. Laura felt like she had been cornered. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. She could no longer hear what Malcolm was saying next. All she could think about was one thing: I'm losing control. Her hand moved before reason could intervene. The sound was very clear. A dry, sharp slap echoed through the first-class cabin. The slap landed squarely on Malcolm Reed's cheek. His head was slightly tilted to one side, not by much, but enough for everyone to clearly see that what had just happened was real. Time seemed to stand still. Jordan jumped to his feet, his eyes wide, his mouth agape but unable to speak. Emily covered her mouth, a wave of nausea rising within her. A passenger in the second row stood frozen, unable to believe their eyes. Laura stood there, her hand still dangling in the air. She could hear her own gasp. For a brief moment she didn't understand what she had just done. Then Malcolm's gaze returned to her. No anger, no pain, no panic. There was only a profound silence, so cold that it sent shivers down Laura's spine. He raised his hand to his cheek, gently touching the spreading heat. He said nothing for a few seconds. The longest seconds of Laura's life. Malcolm inhaled, exhaled. Okay, he said very softly. Just 2 words, but they carried a weight that made Laura's legs feel weak. Jordan trembled. Dad. Malcolm turned to his son, his gaze softening for a split second. I'm fine. He turned back towards Laura. You've just crossed a line, he said, and you'll have to take responsibility. Laura took a step back. You provoked me, she stammered. You made me feel threatened. Malcolm looked at her, his gaze unwavering. I'm sitting still in my seat. No one said another word. No one needed to say anything more. Emily stepped out of the galley, her voice trembling but clear. Laura, we need to report this. Laura turned, her eyes filled with panic. Emily, I don't understand. I understand perfectly, Emily replied. And I've seen it all. Malcolm didn't participate in the conversation. He slowly sat down in his chair as if he had just finished a very tiring task. He placed his hands on his lap and closed his eyes for a few seconds. A single thought echoed in his mind. This is no longer just my problem. Jordan sat down next to his father, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. He looked at Malcolm as if he wanted to engrave this image into his memory. The man didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He didn't lose control. Just stand there silently. The first-class cabin was enveloped in a heavy silence. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something that could not be erased. A single moment that would have far-reaching consequences. And somewhere deep within the system to which this aircraft belongs, a chain of events is about to begin. There were no screams. There were no loud cries. No one rushed in to intervene. There was only a thick, heavy silence so intense that it seemed as if the air in the first-class cabin had stopped moving. Malcolm Reed sat still in seat 3, a back straight, hands neatly placed on his lap. The heat on his cheeks was still there, lingering and very real, but his face showed no pain, no anger, no shock. It's just quiet. Jordan sat beside his father, his whole body trembling slightly. He looked at the red mark gradually appearing on Malcolm's cheek, then looked at Laura Mitchell, who remained frozen in place, her eyes wide, as if she herself couldn't believe what had just happened. "Dad," Jordan whispered, his voice breaking. Malcolm turned to his son very slowly. He looked at Jordan longer than usual, as if to make sure he was seeing what was most important in that moment. "Dad's here," he said. "Dad's fine." Jordan swallowed hard. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to say something. He wanted to do something. But Malcolm's gaze held him back, not with a command, but with unwavering determination. At the front of the cabin, Emily Carter stood motionless. Her heart pounded so hard her ears were ringing. In her mind, the safety training, the reporting procedures, the emergency scenarios, everything was swirling, but none of them had prepared her for this moment. A flight attendant assaulted a passenger. In the middle of first class, in front of dozens of witnesses. Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. "Laura," she said, "you need to leave the passenger area now." Laura turned around as if just waking from a dream. "Emily, you don't, I saw it all." Emily interrupted, her voice firm for the first time that day. And so did everyone else. A man in the second row stood up halfway, then sat back down, apparently considering whether to intervene. A woman in front turned away, but her hand gripped the armrest tightly. Laura looked around. Her gaze swept across each face. There were no more supportive glances, no more unspoken sympathy. Only confusion, fear, and something very close to judgment. "He provoked me," Laura said, her voice high and urgent. "I felt threatened." Malcolm didn't react immediately. He looked at Laura, his gaze so calm that her defense sounded hollow. "She hit me while I was sitting," he said, his voice low and even, "in front of my son. No accusations, just the truth." Laura opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time during the flight, she couldn't find the answer immediately. Emily turned toward the internal intercom, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed the cockpit call button. "Cockpit, this is Emily Carter. We have a serious incident in first class." The captain's voice rang out, still calm but now alert. Specifically, Emily glanced at Malcolm, then at Laura. There was violent behavior from the flight attendants towards a passenger. A brief silence on the other end of the line. Then, understood, preserve the scene. We'll handle it. Laura took a step back. Her legs felt weak. In her mind, everything began to crumble. Regulations, seniority, professional record, none of them were a shield anymore. Malcolm slowly pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket. His movements were unhurried, not secretive, not dramatic. But it was precisely this calmness that drew the attention of many in the compartment. Jordan looked at his father, his eyes full of questions. Malcolm didn't look at his son at the moment. He was looking at his phone screen, unlocking it and tapping on a single name in his favorites list, Evelyn Reed. He put the phone to his ear. No loudspeakers, no fanfare. But the first-class cabin was so quiet that those nearby could still hear his voice. "Mom," Malcolm said. His voice was low and steady. "I'm fine." A brief pause. He listened. "No," he continued. "The child isn't seriously injured, but something serious has happened." Jordan's eyes widened. This was the first time he'd heard his father call his mother in that tone. Not a family tone, but the voice of someone reporting an event that couldn't be taken lightly. "A flight attendant attacked my son," Malcolm said. "On an Atlantic Crown flight?" He listened for a few more seconds, then continued. "You're in seat 3A. There are witnesses." Another flight attendant reported it to the cockpit. Laura stood a few steps away, each word seemingly falling directly into her ears. Her face turned noticeably pale. "Yes," Malcolm said. "I won't make a fuss. I just want things to be properly documented." He ended the call, put the phone down, and returned his hands to their original position on his lap. No threats, no demands, no anger. There is only one terrifying certainty. Jordan looked at his father and whispered, "Did you call Mom, Dad?" Malcolm nodded. "Yes." "Will this go far?" Jordan asked. Malcolm looked at his son, his gaze softening. "It doesn't matter how far he goes. What matters is that he's going in the right direction." Laura felt a slight dizziness. She didn't know who Evelyn Reed was. But the way Malcolm spoke, the way he didn't need to explain further, made her realize that the call wasn't for comfort. "It's a step." Emily stood beside Laura, her voice low but firm. "You need to sit down in the jump seat. Right now." Laura didn't resist. She stepped back to her seat, sat down, her hands trembling on her lap. For the first time in years, she felt incredibly small in this airplane cabin. The first-class cabin remained silent. But it was no longer an ambiguous silence. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed a boundary being broken and understood that the consequences were inevitable. Malcolm leaned his head back in his seat and closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about Laura right now, not thinking about the airline. He was thinking about Jordan. He wondered what his son would remember most from this moment, the slap, or his reaction afterward. Malcolm hoped deep down that Jordan would remember the man who didn't retaliate, the man who didn't let anger get the better of him, the man who understood that sometimes true power doesn't lie in the hand, but in making the right choices at the right time. In the cockpit, procedures are being activated. On the ground, no one knows what's about to happen. But inside this aircraft, one thing is already very clear. This flight will not proceed as planned, and this story has only just begun. The first-class cabin remained silent. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of those who had just witnessed a line being crossed and were waiting for the system's response. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone understood that this could not be ignored. Malcolm Reed sat still in seat 3A. The redness on his cheek had faded a little, but the burning sensation remained. He didn't care about it. He cared about Jordan. Jordan sat up straight, his back stiff, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He wasn't trembling as before, but the tension was still evident in his every breath. "Dad," Jordan said, very softly, "is the plane taking off?" Malcolm glanced at his watch again. The second hand moved slowly. He shook his head slightly. "I don't think so." Jordan swallowed hard. "Because of what just happened, yes," Malcolm replied, "and because of how they have to handle it." In the front row, Laura Mitchell sat on a jump seat, her hands clasped tightly together. Cold sweat began to trickle down the back of her neck. Disjointed thoughts raced through her mind. "I was just doing my job. I was provoked. I didn't mean to." But each time she saw Malcolm Reed sitting silently in the third row, saying nothing more, showing no anger, she felt a surge of fear. Not the fear of retaliation, the fear of being confronted with the truth. Emily Carter stood nearby, trying to maintain a professional demeanor, but her hands trembled slightly. She knew that from this moment on, everything would be recorded. No more hearsay. No more subjective feelings. It would be a record, a report, and its consequences. The internal loudspeaker blared, breaking the silence. "Cabin crew, please remain seated. The captain will announce your arrival shortly." Captain Daniel Harper's calm voice echoed through the cabin, but those listening carefully could detect a subtle tension behind it. In the cockpit, Daniel Harper and co-pilot Linda Morales looked at each other. On the screens in front of them, the flight parameters were stable. No technical problems, no weather warnings. But this wasn't a technical decision. "We have a flight attendant who assaulted a passenger," Linda said, her voice low. "There are witnesses." Daniel nodded, his hand resting on the control stick but not moving. "I heard you." "What does the procedure say?" Linda asked. Daniel let out a slow sigh. "The procedure states that any violent behavior on board, especially from the flight crew, is considered a security incident." Linda looked toward the cockpit door. "And what about the security incident?" "Not taking off," Daniel replied. "Not until it's been dealt with." Linda was silent for a few seconds. "That passenger? Did he have any requests?" Daniel shook his head. "No. According to Emily's report, he was very calm, not causing any trouble." Linda shook her head slightly, as if disbelieving. "It's always the same. The biggest things always start with the quietest people." Daniel looked at the screen, then at his watch. "We have no other choice." He pressed the button to contact the ground control center. "Atlantic Crown Ops, this is Flight 482, Daniel said. "We have a serious security incident. A flight attendant has acted violently toward a passenger. I request that the aircraft be held at the gate and that the incident response procedure be activated." A brief silence on the other end of the line. Then, Understood 482? Hold your position. We'll coordinate shortly. Daniel cut off the connection and turned to Linda. We'll go back to the gate. Linda nodded. The passengers won't be happy. Daniel looked straight ahead. They'll understand. And if they don't, then this is still the right decision. The loudspeaker blared again. This time it was Daniel Harper's voice, clear and decisive. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Due to a security issue requiring procedural action, the flight will temporarily be delayed and will return to the gate. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. There was a slight murmur in the first-class cabin, a few sighs, a few displeased shakes of the head, but no one stood up. No one protested. Jordan looked at his father, his eyes wide. They really came back. Malcolm nodded. Yes. Dad, are you scared? Jordan asked. Malcolm thought for a few seconds. No. Dad feels it's light. Jordan looked at him surprised. Light, because it's no longer just Dad's responsibility, Malcolm said. The system has to speak up. The plane began to taxi slowly, moving away from its takeoff position. Through the window, Jordan watched the runway receding behind him. It felt like time was turning back. Laura Mitchell clearly felt this change. The sound of the wheels rolling on the runway was distinctly different as the plane turned around. She looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly. Has things really come to this point? She wondered. Emily approached Laura, speaking in a low voice. Laura, the ground and security manager will be boarding. Laura nodded, not reacting. She no longer had the energy to resist or defend herself. In her mind, the image of the slap kept repeating, terrifyingly clear. Malcolm glanced down the aisle and saw Laura with her head bowed. He felt no triumph, no victory, just a quiet sadness. He thought about how many times things like this had happened to people who had no voice, no witnesses, no place where the system could be forced to stop. Jordan followed his father's gaze. What are you thinking about, Dad? Malcolm replied softly. I was thinking, if it wasn't me today, it might have been someone else, and maybe that person wouldn't have been protected like this. Jordan fell silent. He was beginning to understand that this was more than just a slap in the face. The plane came to a complete stop as it reconnected with the jet bridge. The engines were significantly quieter. The cabin doors remained closed, but the atmosphere was different. A few minutes passed. Then, the loudspeaker blared again. Passengers, please remain seated. Security personnel and airline representatives will board the aircraft to handle the situation. Laura closed her eyes. A single tear silently rolled down her cheek. Not from complete regret, but because she knew that from this moment on, her professional life would never be the same again. Malcolm placed his hand on Jordan's shoulder. Are you all right? Jordan nodded. I'm proud of you, Dad. Malcolm smiled very slightly. Thank you. The hatch opened. Light from outside flooded in, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of those advancing. The system finally took on a concrete form. And with that, the story on this plane enters a whole new chapter. The airplane door opened slowly, emitting a familiar soft hiss. But this time the sound wasn't one of welcome or preparation for takeoff. It was more like the opening act of an informal trial, where every gaze was that of a witness. 2 airport security officers stepped forward. Following them was a man in a gray suit, a small name tag on his lapel, Mark Reynolds, regional manager of Atlantic Crown Airlines. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the first-class cabin as if trying to take in the entire situation in just a few seconds. Hello everyone, Mark said, his voice low and controlled. We're here to deal with an incident. No one answered. There was no need to answer. The problem was clearly evident. Laura Mitchell sat in her jump seat, her hands clasped together. Seeing Mark Reynolds sent a jolt through her. She'd met him a few times at internal meetings. He was a man of procedures, a man of reports, a man who cared only about consequences, not feelings. Emily Carter stood tall, trying to remain calm. She knew she had to speak, and she also knew that from this moment on there was no turning back. One of the two security officers stepped forward, his voice firm but not harsh. "We need to speak with the passenger in seat 3A. Malcolm Reed opened his eyes. He rose slowly, unhurriedly. As he stood, his height and stature made the airplane cabin seem smaller, but his gaze remained calm. "Yes," he said, "I'm here." Jordan jumped to his feet instinctively. Dad Malcolm placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Sit down. It's all right." The gesture was seen by many. A passenger in the seat in front let out a soft sigh, as if reassured. The security guard nodded to Malcolm. "Sir, could you tell us what happened?" Malcolm glanced around the compartment. He saw eyes on him. There was curiosity, there was anxiety, and also the belated remorse of those who had been silent for too long. "Before I answer," Malcolm said, his voice low and clear, "I want to confirm that everything will be recorded accurately." Mark Reynolds nodded quickly. "Certainly, sir. We're taking notes." Malcolm took a deep breath. "I was sitting in seat 3A with my son. I followed all safety instructions. During that time, the chief flight attendant, Laura Mitchell, approached me several times in an unprofessional manner. After a brief exchange, she slapped me." He paused. No embellishment, no emphasis. Just stating exactly what had happened. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier. Jordan bowed his head, his teeth clenched. Emily, standing nearby, felt her throat dry up. The security officer turned to Laura. "Miss Mitchell, do you confirm or deny this?" Laura looked up. Her eyes were red. Her voice trembled. He made me feel threatened. He was always arguing." Mark Reynolds frowned. "Were you touched by any passengers?" Laura shook her head. "No." "Did he stand up or approach her?" the security officer continued to ask. Laura shook her head again. "No." "Did he raise his voice, use threatening or insulting language?" Laura was silent. 1 second, 2 seconds. "No," she said softly. At that moment, so many things collapsed at once. Emily stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clearer than she thought. "I am a witness." Mark Reynolds turned around. "Miss Carter." "Yes," Emily replied. "I was nearby the whole time. The passenger wasn't disruptive. No threats, no safety breaches. The slap was completely unprovoked." Emily's words were like a nail hammered into an already fragile situation. A male passenger in the second row stood up. "I saw it too," he said. "The man didn't do anything. She lost control." A woman in front nodded. "I recorded a bit," she said, her voice hesitant. "It's not very clear, but you can see the action." Mark Reynolds closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his face had changed. No longer the image-conscious manager, but someone calculating the damage. "Thank you," he said. "We will take note of everything." He turned to Laura. "Miss Mitchell, according to airline regulations, I am compelled to ask you to leave your duties immediately. You will be escorted off the aircraft to speak with Human Resources and Security." Laura opened her mouth but couldn't say anything. She stood up, her legs slightly giving way, and had to hold onto the chair for balance. Emily looked at Laura, her eyes filled with sadness. Not pure pity, but regret for someone who had gone too far without being able to stop. Laura followed the security officer toward the compartment door. Each step felt heavy as lead. As she passed Malcolm, she paused for a second. "Are you satisfied?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Malcolm looked at her. His eyes held neither anger nor schadenfreude. "No," he said. "I just want the right thing to be called by its right name." Laura bowed her head and turned away. The compartment door closed behind her, separating her from the space she once controlled. Mark Reynolds turned to Malcolm. His voice was softer, distinctly diplomatic. "Mr. Reed, on behalf of Atlantic Crown Airlines, I offer my deepest apologies." Malcolm nodded. "I understand. We will rearrange the trip for you and your son," Mark continued. "And we will contact you to discuss further if you agree." Malcolm looked at Jordan, then at Mark. "I will cooperate," he said. But I'm not looking for personal compensation, I'm looking for accountability. Mark Reynolds understood the meaning of that statement perfectly. He nodded slowly. Jordan watched as Laura was led away. "Dad, is it all over?" Malcolm shook his head slightly. "No, son. This is just the beginning of things being seen in a more objective light." The first-class cabin gradually returned to a state of quiet, but it was no longer a tense silence. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed a hard-to-swallow but necessary truth. Emily returned to her seat, letting out a long sigh. She knew that from today onwards her job wouldn't be as simple as before. But she also knew she had just done the right thing. Malcolm sat down in a chair. Jordan leaned against the armrest, a feeling of exhaustion rising after the prolonged stress. "Dad," Jordan said softly, "I think I understand better now." Malcolm smiled very slightly. "Understand what I understand," Jordan replied, "that power isn't always loud." Malcolm placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "That's right. Out there within the Atlantic Crown Airlines system, initial reports are being sent out, urgent emails are being drafted, calls are being made. The gears have started turning. And once they start turning, they won't stop just because of an apology. Some things don't end when the door closes. They've just begun to move into a different space. A larger one. A more dangerous one. And there's no longer room for passive silence." When Laura Mitchell was escorted off the plane, the first-class cabin didn't erupt as many had expected. There was no applause, no loud murmurs. Just a very different kind of silence, as if everyone had just gone through a moment that made them question themselves. Malcolm Reed sat in seat 3A, looking down at his hands. These were the hands that had signed hundreds of contracts, the hands that had shaken thousands of people. But they were also the hands that had just been slapped in front of his son, in a space supposedly considered civilized. Jordan leaned back in his chair, his eyes red but dry. He wasn't crying anymore. His emotions had shifted to a different state. A state of mind of someone who had just seen the world was far more complex than he had ever believed. "Dad," Jordan whispered, "what will happen now?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window. On the runway, another plane was taking off, soaring into the sky as if nothing had happened. "Now," he said slowly, "the story no longer belongs to us." Jordan frowned. "What do you mean, Dad?" "What I mean is," Malcolm continued, "from the moment there's a report, witnesses, and a record, it becomes part of the system." Elsewhere in the airport, Laura Mitchell sat in a makeshift security office. The fluorescent lights shone down cold and merciless. She clenched her hands tightly, her fingernails digging into her flesh. "You have the right to remain silent," the security officer said in a flat tone. "Anything you say could be used in an internal investigation." Laura nodded but wasn't really listening. In her mind, Malcolm Reed's image kept flashing, that look in his eyes, no anger, no panic. As if he had known beforehand that things would turn out this way. "What have I done?" she wondered, but the question came too late. Upstairs at Atlantic Crown Airlines headquarters, Mark Reynolds strode quickly into the emergency meeting room. 3 people were already seated, their faces serious. On the table lay a hastily printed preliminary report, the paper still warm. "We have a big problem," Mark said as soon as he sat down. "The passenger who was attacked is Malcolm Reed." A middle-aged man at the head of the table looked up, which Malcolm Reed. Mark swallowed hard. "The CEO of Reed Maritime Group." The room was silent for a very long time. "Are you sure?" another person asked. Mark nodded. "Probably." The man at the head of the table leaned back in his chair and let out a heavy sigh. "Oh my God. Reed Maritime Group is more than just a large company. It's a strategic shipping partner for many corporations, including Atlantic Crown Airlines itself, in the area of ancillary logistics. The name doesn't appear in the tabloids, but in executive circles it carries a very real weight." "Do you have the video?" the only woman in the room asked. Mark nodded. "There's at least one piece of information from the passengers. Witness many of them, including flight attendants." The room fell into another silence. This time not out of shock. but because they all understood what it meant. "We need to prepare for the worst-case scenario," the man at the head of the table said. "Media, legal, internal." At the same time, in the airport's private lounge, Malcolm and Jordan were escorted to a separate area. Airline staff brought them water, apologized, and repeated their trained phrases. Malcolm listened and nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The phone vibrated gently in his hand. "Evelyn Reed." He answered the phone. "Are you all right?" Evelyn's voice was low but not panicked. "I'm fine," Malcolm replied. "Jordan is fine too." "I just got a call from the company's lawyer," Evelyn said. "They know." Malcolm nodded slightly, though he knew she couldn't see. "I guess so. How do you want to handle this?" Evelyn asked. Malcolm looked at Jordan, who was sitting silently, his hands clasped together. His gaze was much more somber than before. "I don't want to turn this into a revenge plot," Malcolm said, "but I also don't want it to be buried." Evelyn paused for a moment. "I understand. I want it to be seen for what it truly is," Malcolm continued. "Not just the actions of one individual. It's a flaw in the system that allows things like this to happen." Evelyn sighed softly. "Then you'll need more than just an apology." "I know." Jordan looked up at his father. "Are you talking to Mom, Dad?" Malcolm nodded, smiling very slightly. "Yes." Jordan hesitated. "What did Mom say?" She said. Malcolm replied that we are not alone. In another corner of the airport, Emily Carter sat alone, a cup of cold coffee in her hand. She stared at the dark liquid but saw nothing. In her mind, every moment of the flight replayed in her head. She knew that tomorrow, or even tonight, she would have to write a report. She also knew that speaking the truth might cost her her job security. But when Emily recalled Jordan's gaze, and the way Malcolm had placed his hand on his son's shoulder, she felt a strange sense of certainty. There are things more important than peace of mind, she thought. In the control room, an internal email was sent with the brief subject line, "Critical incident, high priority." Departments began responding. Legal requested documentation. Media prepared a press release. Human Resources temporarily suspended Laura Mitchell's case. Everything happened very quickly. No drama, no emotion, just the system protecting itself. But Malcolm knew that it was precisely that smoothness that was worth considering. He turned to Jordan. "Doesn't that seem strange?" "What's so strange about that?" Jordan asked. "That things can change so quickly," Malcolm said. "Just in a single moment." Jordan thought for a moment. "I feel scared." Malcolm nodded. "So do I, Dad. But I also see," Jordan continued, his voice slowing, "that if we don't speak up, nothing will change." Malcolm smiled. Not a smile of joy. Rather the smile of a father who has just seen his child take another step in understanding the world. "That's right," he said. "And that's why Dad didn't stay silent." Outside the waiting area, a reporter was on the phone, whispering but speaking urgently. Somewhere a video was being sent. A story was leaving the confined space of the airplane cabin to enter a place where it would no longer be easily controlled. Malcolm stood up, draping his coat over his shoulders. He knew that from this moment on, his life might be noisier. But he also knew that some silences needed to be broken. He placed his hand on Jordan's shoulder. "Are you ready?" he asked. Jordan took a deep breath, then nodded. "Okay." They walked out of the waiting room, heading towards a story from which there was no turning back. The news didn't break out with a loud bang. It spread like water seeping through tiny cracks, silently, quickly, and unstoppable. Initially, it was just a short video filmed from an oblique angle in first class. The image was shaky. The audio was unclear. But the swing of the arm was unmistakable. A flight attendant, a black passenger. A moment of violence without context. That's all that's needed. As Malcolm Reed and Jordan exited the airport through a private exit, Malcolm's phone began ringing incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, emails, all from familiar and unfamiliar numbers. "You don't need to respond yet," Evelyn Reed said as they sat in the car. Her voice was calm, but Malcolm knew she was managing a lot at once. "The legal team is watching. The media will be calling very soon." Malcolm looked out the window. The city moved by slowly, as if unaware that a story was unfolding right now. "I don't want to run away," Malcolm said. "But I also don't want to turn this into a show." Evelyn nodded. "I know. But someone else would have made it that way if you hadn't said anything." Jordan sat in the back, silently, listening to every word. He opened his phone, then paused. "Dad," he said, his voice low. "Video is everywhere." Malcolm turned to look at his son. "What did you see?" Jordan hesitated. "I see. A lot of people are angry, but some people are saying they don't really know what happened." Malcolm nodded. "That's always how it works." At Atlantic Crown Airlines headquarters, the communications room was brightly lit, even though it was past closing time. A large screen displayed a headline that was rapidly spreading on social media. "Flight attendant accused of assaulting black CEO on domestic flight." Mark Reynolds stood in the middle of the room, hands on his hips. "We need a statement," he said. "Right now." "Be careful," the legal representative cautioned. "We can't admit fault yet. But we can't remain silent either," the communications manager replied. Silence now would be interpreted as covering up. The debate was intense. Words were dissected. Every word was carefully considered, not to tell the truth, but to minimize damage. Meanwhile, in a quiet hotel room, Malcolm sat alone by the window. Evelyn and Jordan had gone out for dinner at his suggestion. He needed some quiet time. The phone vibrated. An unknown number. Malcolm hesitated for a second, then answered the phone. "Mr. Reed," a professional voice said from the other end. "This is Claire Donovan, a reporter for Global Wire. I would like to request a brief comment on the incident on the Atlantic Crown flight." Malcolm looked down at the city lights. "I'm not ready to answer that right now," he said. "I understand," Claire replied, "but you should know that the story is being told without your voice." Malcolm remained silent. "You don't have to do it right away," Claire continued. "But if you choose to speak up, I want you to know that we're here to listen." Malcolm ended the call and put the phone down. He wasn't angry, not worried, just felt a familiar pressure. He had spent his life proving he deserved to be in places where he wasn't meant to be. But for the first time, he had to decide whether or not he should step into the spotlight, not for myself, but for what this story represents. In another small apartment in the city, Laura Mitchell sat in front of her laptop screen. She didn't dare open the video, but the headlines were everywhere. Her name wasn't mentioned directly, but words like flight attendant violence and discrimination intertwined like a net. Her phone vibrated. A text message from a former colleague. "What's going on?" Laura didn't answer. She closed her laptop and buried her face in her hands. For the first time in her life, she realized that a single moment of losing control could define how someone else perceived her. She remembered Malcolm Reed's gaze. No resentment, no revenge. That frightened her more than any accusation. Across the city, Emily Carter sat on her bed, laptop open in front of her. She was writing the official report. Each word slowed her hand. She knew that what she wrote would affect not only Laura, but also her own career. The phone vibrated. A text message from Mom. "Are you okay?" Emily smiled sadly. "I'm fine. I only did the right thing," she replied. She sent the report, closing her eyes for a few seconds. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she wouldn't regret it. Back in his hotel room, Malcolm stood up, walked to the desk, and opened his laptop. He didn't turn on the news. He opened a blank document. He started typing. Not a press release, not an accusation, just a collection of scattered thoughts. What hurt me wasn't the slap itself, it was the familiarity of that moment. He paused, deleted it, and then typed it again. "I've been in rooms where my silence was misinterpreted as arrogance and my calmness was seen as a challenge." He writes slowly. Not because he's searching for the perfect words, but because he's asking himself what he wants most from this story. A public apology, a lawsuit, or a dialogue that has never taken place. Evelyn and Jordan returned. Jordan stopped at the door and looked at his father. "What are you writing, Dad?" he asked. Malcolm turned and looked at his son. "I'm trying to figure out what I should say." Jordan stepped closer. "I think, Dad, you should tell the truth. No need to raise your voice." Malcolm smiled. "Who did you learn that from?" Jordan shrugged. "From Dad." Malcolm closed his laptop and took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't control how this story was told on social media, but he could control how he walked into it. He picked up his phone and looked up Claire Donovan's number. "Claire," he said when the other end of the line picked up, "I'm ready to talk." But not in a sensational way. Claire was silent for a second, then replied, "I promise I'll let you say it your way." Malcolm looked at Jordan, then at Evelyn. They nodded. Outside, the city continues its daily rhythm. But somewhere else, a larger dialogue is about to begin. It's not about a slap, it's about what makes it possible. The interview didn't take place in a brightly lit studio. No green screen, no slow-motion logos, no scrolling text at the bottom of the screen. Claire Donovan suggested a different place, quieter, more neutral. A small library on the grounds of an old university where the softest footsteps served as a reminder that every word spoken there needed to be carefully considered. Malcolm Reed arrived 10 minutes early. He wore a light blue shirt, no tie. Not to project an approachable image, but because he never believed that power needed to be clothed. Jordan sat in the back seat with Evelyn. They weren't in the frame, but Malcolm knew they were there, and that made him straighten his back a little. Claire Donovan set the tape recorder down on the table. "Thank you for agreeing," she said. "I know this wasn't easy." Malcolm nodded. "I'm not here because it's easy." Claire smiled slightly. "I won't ask you about the technical details of the incident. There's video. There are reports. I want to ask you a different question." She paused, looking straight at him. "What prompted you to speak out?" Malcolm thought for a few seconds. The library was so quiet you could hear the sound of pages turning somewhere in the distance. "Because I've been silent too many times," he said. Claire didn't interrupt. "Not just on that flight," Malcolm continued, "but throughout my life, I've learned to be silent in order to survive, to avoid being seen as annoying, to avoid being labeled." He looked down at his hands. "But when I saw my son sitting next to me, I realized that if I continued to remain silent, I was teaching him that silence is the price of respect." Claire took a soft breath. "Did you feel discriminated against in that moment?" Malcolm looked up. "I feel a sense of familiarity." The answer caused the atmosphere to freeze. "Familiar," Claire repeated. "Yes," Malcolm said. "I'm used to being doubted, used to my composure being misinterpreted, used to having to prove that I belong to the spaces I've paid for, worked for, and dedicated myself to being in." He didn't speak loudly, but every word that fell carried weight. "The slap wasn't the hardest thing," he continued. "The hardest thing was realizing that at 30,000 feet, with all the regulations, training, and promises of safety, it could still happen." Claire paused for a moment. "Are you angry?" Malcolm shook his head. "I was angry, but not then." When Claire asked, "When I got back to my hotel room," Malcolm replied, "I realized that this story would just fade away like so many others, and if I didn't speak up, it would just become another viral, outraged video that would be forgotten." Claire nodded. "So, what do you want to happen next?" Malcolm took a deep breath. "I want systems to be held accountable, not to punish a single individual, but to ask, why did this happen, and how can we prevent it from happening again?" The interview lasted longer than expected, not for drama but for depth. Malcolm spoke of meetings where he was the only black person in the room, of being told to calm down when he simply disagreed, of how weariness had accumulated over the years silently but persistently. Claire didn't corner him, she let him speak. When the recording stopped, Malcolm sat still for a long time. Jordan walked over. "Dad said it so well," he whispered. Malcolm smiled. "Dad was just telling the truth." Evelyn placed her hand on his shoulder. "And that's the strongest thing." That evening the interview was published. No sensational headlines, no manipulated images, Just one simple line. Malcolm read, "I didn't speak out because of the slap. I spoke out because of the silence." The reaction came faster than anyone anticipated. It's not just about anger. It's about listening. Other CEOs shared the post. Professors, activists, and former flight attendants wrote lengthy comments saying they had seen it before. Ordinary people left comments like, "I've been in that situation too." Atlantic Crown Airlines issued a second statement. This time the wording changed. No more unfortunate incident. No more under investigation. Instead, it's a systemic failure. An emergency board meeting was convened. Mark Reynolds sat in the back row watching the numbers on the screen. The stock was falling. Partners were asking questions. The brand image was eroding by the hour. "We need concrete action," one member said, "not just words." At home, Laura Mitchell sat in front of the TV watching excerpts from the interview. She realized she wasn't mentioned by name. Not slandered. Not made into the central villain. That made her hurt even more. She turned off the TV and sat silently in the darkness. For the first time, she asked herself not "why did this happen to me," but "why would I do that to someone else?" Emily Carter also watched the interview on her phone during her break. She read each line slowly. When she reached the part where Malcolm talks about silence, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. Perhaps she thought she had made the right choice. A few days later, Malcolm received an email from the management of Atlantic Crown Airlines. Not a generic apology, an invitation. They wanted to meet him, not to negotiate, but to listen. Malcolm read his email, then closed his laptop. He looked at Jordan, who was doing his homework at the dining table. "What do you think?" he asked. "If I sit down and talk to them?" Jordan looked up. "I think, if they really want to change, then Dad should help them understand." Malcolm smiled. "You know, I'm not sure they're ready." Jordan shrugged. "But if Dad doesn't go, they'll never have to get ready." Malcolm was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Outside, the world was still noisy, but inside him, a new stillness was forming. Not the silence of resignation. Rather, it's the silence before something bigger begins. Atlantic Crown Airlines meeting room is located on the top floor. Transparent glass walls, a long wooden table, daylight streams in concealing nothing. A room designed to project power, transparency, and control. Malcolm Reed walked in with Evelyn. No lawyers, no assistants, no media team. He was simply a man who decided not to remain silent any longer. On the other side of the table, 7 people were seated. The senior management. Mark Reynolds was there, looking more tired than the last time they met. Their faces didn't show defensiveness, but rather the wariness of people who understood this was no longer a short-term crisis. "Thank you for coming," the council chairman began. "We know you're not obligated to be here." Malcolm nodded slightly. "That's right." A brief silence. No one was in a hurry to break it. "We didn't invite you here to ask you to withdraw," the woman sitting on the left said. "We invited you because we read the interview, and we realized this is more than just one incident." Malcolm looked at each person. His gaze was neither challenging nor lenient. "I'm not here to tell my story," he said. "I'm here to talk about what that story represents." The chairman nodded. "We are ready to listen." Malcolm took a deep breath. He wasn't reading from paper. He wasn't using slides. He wasn't citing data. He speaks from experience. "I don't believe Laura Mitchell woke up that day with the intention of hurting anyone," he said. "I believe she was tired, under pressure, and had never been taught how to identify deeply ingrained biases." A few people in the room shifted slightly in their chairs. But Malcolm continued, "Tiredness doesn't create prejudice. It only reveals what already exists." The air in the room became heavier. "Your system," Malcolm said slowly, "is built to handle technical risks very well, but it's too weak when it comes to human risks." No one objected. "I don't want to fire another person," he said. "I want you to change the way you train, support, and evaluate your people." The chairman leaned back in his chair. "What exactly do you want us to do?" Malcolm looked straight ahead. "I want you to invest seriously in cognitive bias training. not a symbolic workshop. A long-term evaluated accountable program. Evelyn placed a stack of documents on the table. Not a request, but a proposal. Reed Maritime Group is willing to finance the startup phase, she said. Not to buy anything, but to demonstrate that we are not seeking short-term gains. The room was silent for a long time. Finally, the woman who had been speaking earlier said, "If we do this, what do you expect in return?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "It's a real change. Not an agreement. Not a contract. Just a commitment." The meeting lasted over 3 hours. By the time Malcolm and Evelyn left the building, it was late afternoon. The last rays of sunlight reflected off the skyscraper's glass, softer than in the morning. "Are you all right?" Evelyn asked as they stepped outside. Malcolm nodded. "I find it light, not because of the victory, but because he said everything he needed to say." 3 months later, Atlantic Crown Airlines announced a new mandatory internal training program for all flight crew and frontline management. No big slogans, no flashy advertising, but it has a clear structure. It has independent experts. It has an anonymous feedback mechanism. Emily Carter was one of the first to join. She sat in the training room listening to stories she'd never heard seriously before. When it came to the open discussion, she raised her hand. "I've been in that airplane cabin," she said, "and I've seen what happens when we're not equipped to understand each other." The room was silent. No one laughed. No one flinched. Laura Mitchell no longer works for Atlantic Crown. She moved to a different city. Started over at a smaller job. Less power, but more time to think. One evening she sat alone rereading Malcolm Reed's interview. This time not defensively, but with acknowledgement. She closed her laptop and looked out the window. For the first time, she didn't try to justify herself. 1 year later, Malcolm and Jordan were at the airport again. Not Atlantic Crown. A different airline. A different flight. Jordan is taller now. His shoulders are broader. His eyes are more mature. "Dad," he said as they lined up to board the plane. "Are you still scared?" Malcolm smiled. "Yes." "Then why does Dad still fly?" Jordan asked. "Fear isn't a reason to stop," Malcolm replied. "It's a reason to go the right way." They entered the airplane cabin. A flight attendant smiled and nodded in greeting. There was no scrutinizing gaze, no suspicious tone. It was just a very ordinary moment. Malcolm sat down in his seat and fastened his seatbelt. He looked at his son. "Do you remember last year's flight?" he asked. Jordan nodded. "I remember." "What do you remember most?" Malcolm asked. Jordan thought for a moment. "Not a slap." Malcolm was surprised. "So what is it?" Jordan replied slowly. "It's my way of not letting it define me." Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment. A warm sensation spread through his chest. The plane began to taxi. The engines roared in a familiar sound. Not everything has been healed. The system is not perfect, but some things are no longer the same as they used to be. And there are some things that can't be slapped away. Dignified, choice, and the ability to transform a painful moment into a small but real step forward. The plane took off. Under the blue sky, Malcolm Reed sat still, needing no further proof. This story isn't just about a slap on an airplane. It's about the invisible slaps that so many people have endured in their lives. It could be disrespect at work, the suspicious look when you walk into a space that's not meant for you, the times you're told to calm down when you're just speaking the truth. The biggest lesson of the story isn't the punishment, but the choice of how to react. The protagonist didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he didn't let anger control him. He understood that sometimes silence means defeat, but sometimes calmness is the greatest strength. For older audiences, this story reminds us that times, dignity doesn't lie in how loudly we speak. Asterisk. It lies in not losing ourselves when we are hurt. Asterisk. And that real change doesn't come from taking someone down. Asterisk. It comes from forcing the system to examine itself. If there's one takeaway from this story, it's this: you can't control how others treat you, but you can always control how you choose to stand up for yourself. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story to the end. If you see yourself in it even just a little, please let us know by liking, sharing the video, and subscribing to the channel. Each subscription not only helps the channel grow, but also helps keep these kind, insightful, and relatable stories being told. See you in the next story.